As we all know, laziness drives progress. Instead of chasing after the not-so-friendly animals of the Pleistocene with a spear, Stone Age humans first realized they could throw their spears. Then they discovered they could throw them more efficiently using a specially designed wooden tool, a spear thrower. By the Mesolithic era, with the onset of a hunting crisis and the shift to smaller game, lighter hunting tools like darts and arrows became widespread, along with a device to shoot them, the bow. Later, during antiquity, people began experimenting with combining a bow and a frame that could hold the weapon in a ready-to-fire position, making shooting easier. This invention was called the gastrophetes. Its name, which amusingly sounds like a digestive remedy, translates as belly bow because it was loaded by pressing it against the stomach. Around the same time, or maybe even earlier, something similar existed in Asia. However, the true evolution of the bow into a deadly weapon didn't happen until the Middle Ages. Reading history books, you've probably come across two polarizing opinions. The first claims that the crossbow was a slow and inefficient weapon. The second argues that this weapon, once banned by the church, was a devastating game-changer, nearly causing the downfall of knights and plate armor. Crossbows started spreading in Europe during the 10th and 11th centuries. For instance, on March 26, 1199, Richard I, better known as Richard the Lionheart, was killed by a crossbow bolt. However, the true leap in crossbow development happened in the 13th century, with the introduction of composite arms made of layered wood and horn. Rumor has it that this technology was borrowed from the Arabs. With these advancements, the increased power of crossbows required special mechanisms to draw the string, making reloading slower. But the real transformation came in the 14th century. Crossbows began to feature steel arms and winding mechanisms for cocking. However, the use of steel revealed the weapon's technological limits. While steel arms could deliver enough energy to bolts to rival modern pistol bullets, shooting them as far as 400 meters, this stronger is better principle had its downsides. Thick steel limbs became slower to uncoil, reducing the bolt's initial speed. Before diving into the main question of this video, there's an important chronological detail worth noting. Crossbows with steel limbs appeared at least by the mid-14th century. Meanwhile, plate armor became widely used only toward the end of the same century. This means the enhanced crossbows weren't a response to plate armor, but predated it. Referring to historical sources, we should mention Ralph Payne Galway's famous book on crossbows. When addressing the question of whether crossbows could penetrate plate armor, the author first claims that war crossbows could pierce any armor of their time, or at least knock an opponent down or stun them. He also mentions that both crossbows and early firearms could penetrate chainmail and brigandines. However, according to Payne Galway, by the 15th century, armor had become significantly thicker. So, could crossbows penetrate plate armor? Payne Galway doesn't give a definitive answer, noting only that knights feared troops armed with arquebuses and crossbows. He then shifts to discussing hunting. He points out that firearms, which began arming militias in the mid-15th century, replaced crossbows in Europe faster than bows did in England. For instance, at the Battle of Morad in 1476, over 6,000 soldiers were armed with firearms. By the Siege of Turin in 1536, guns had completely replaced crossbows, and the French army reportedly had only one crossbowman. Meanwhile, plate armor remained in use until the late 16th century, outlasting the crossbow's era of widespread use. But could crossbows pierce plate armor? Most researchers agree with the opinion of historian and weapons expert Yuri Shokarev. On one hand, crossbows with a draw weight of 350 kilograms or more, and let's note, some crossbows had draw weights of up to 500 kilograms, could pierce knightly armor. On the other hand, in his book Bows and Crossbows, Shokarev explains that handheld medieval crossbows couldn't pierce knightly armor at longer distances. Yet, in another work, Shokarev mentions that even a draw weight of 165 kilograms with a string travel of 13 centimeters was sufficient to pierce armor. British researchers have made things clear. To punch through typical plate armor, you'd need a crossbow with a whopping 400-kilogram draw weight and a hefty 70-gram bolt. Weapons capable of such power were around when plate armor was in use. However, how dangerous the bolt was to the knight after penetrating the armor isn't always clear. The verdict? A heavy crossbow could pierce plate armor, but it wasn't easy, and the effective range was limited. Modern attempts to replicate this with powerful crossbows often end in failure.